Hello and welcome to the Changemakers LA podcast. My name is Tanua Thrash Intook, and I'm the Executive Director of the Local Initiative Support Corporation for the Los Angeles office, also known as LISC LA. In today's episode, we'll be talking about economic development and community investment in the time of COVID-19. We've got some great special guests for today. First, I'd like to welcome Michaela Randolph, who currently serves as board president of the South LA or SOLA Food Co-op, a startup grocery store owned by the community to service South Los Angeles. In this role, Michaela provides strategic guidance to move the cooperative to store opening. Michaela is a native South Angelino, a mother of a preteen daughter, and owner of Randolph Consulting Boutique. It's a boutique consulting firm that works to improve communities through policy and partnerships. Michaela, welcome. I saw you smile when I talked about your daughter.
Thank you. It's a role I hold dear, so thank you so much for having me today.
I totally understand. Thanks for being here. I've got a teen daughter now who's no longer preteen.
Oh my goodness. Yes, mine will be a teen in December, so all in due time.
Yes. Great. Well, we've also got with us today Mary M. Lee. Mary consults with community-based organizations, public officials, government agencies, and philanthropy, working on dismantling racially biased systems and structures to build just and equitable neighborhoods. She is former deputy director of Policy Link, a national advocacy organization working to advance racial equity, economic, and social justice. During her tenure at Policy Link, she provided research, strategic planning, technical assistance, and training to public and private agencies, collaborating to build healthy communities. She has co-authored countless reports, journals, and articles on access to healthy food, the built environment, and the impact of place and race on health. Mary Lee, thanks for joining us. Oh, Mary Lee, we've got you muted.
Sorry about that. I'm delighted to be here, mostly to be able to have this incredible conversation with some really wonderful advocates. Thank you for having us.
Well, we've learned from the best, Mary Lee, and that is you. So thanks for being on here. Last, but certainly not least, we have Robert Lewis here with us. Robert is the president and board chair of the Black Cooperative Investment Fund, a nonprofit that provides microloans to develop a capital and promote economic empowerment specifically for Southern California's African American community. He is also the community benefits manager for the LA Care Health Plan and an alumnus of Occidental College and Howard University.
I'm just thrilled to be with all of you today. I love having these conversations with folks who are just as passionate about economic empowerment and the need to intentionally focus on the economic needs of the Black community. I'm happy to represent BCIF and the community of supporters involved with the organization. And so let's get to it.
Well, great. I think that's a great segue into sort of what this conversation is all about, Robert. You know, with the advent of the COVID-19 crisis impacting all corners of our national economy right now, Los Angeles's businesses are looking to adapt their strategies to try and mitigate those impacts. For small businesses, we know this has been especially difficult during these times. And while we know the federal Paycheck Protection Program failed to pass the second round of funding distribution, only 5% of small businesses received financial support during round one of the distribution, although more than 60% applied. Today, we're going to be talking about how small businesses, in particular, how Black, diverse, and minority-owned businesses are pivoting to meet the needs of their customers and employees, and how they're looking to remain in business, and how collective economic impact models may help to do that work, because each of you are working on that in some ways. So let's start out with Michaela. Michaela, the SOLA Food Co-op is cooperatively owned, from what we understand, which means that the local community members have a say in how the business is run. Why do you think cooperative ownership of a food business in South LA is so important, especially given the COVID-19 crisis?
Thank you so much, Tanua, for that question. I think the work of the cooperative is so important. And I have really adopted this mantra of now more than ever, specifically in this time of COVID. And the reason why I feel like a cooperatively owned business is so important now is because we have seen so many mom and pop businesses close, very small businesses close in our community. And early on during this pandemic, I really thought about what will recovery look like, especially in South LA, especially in Black and Brown communities where there's been so much disinvestment. And so, what I feel like is promising is that the cooperative model does not ask, "Oh, what can I do?" As an individual, but it really does ask, "What can we collectively do together?" And so, I think really tapping into that collective consciousness is this opportunity, to seize the moment. And I just want to see cooperatives all over the place. And it also offers a different business model than just like, oh, okay, I want to start my own business. But I think there's a back to basics almost about cooperatives, right? Because cooperatives actually have a really long history in the United States, and they have a long history in the African American community. So I think it's a really great opportunity to kind of go back to basics, relearn our history, and develop some alternative models to how we do business in our community.
Now more than ever. I mean, yeah, this is great, Michaela, and thanks for talking about that. Because if you think about the fact that some of the businesses that are closing, this idea that it was, maybe one person or one family, but with a cooperative model, you've got sort of a distributed set of owners and potentially resources to help a business survive when there is a crisis like this. So, Mary, let's talk a little bit about the importance of incentivizing small businesses in order to encourage Black communities to reclaim their local economies. How do we incentivize even, getting into business, remaining in business, and being part of having an impact on our local economies, especially for Black communities right now?
Right. It is a particular issue for Black communities because, as Michaela alluded to, the small business option or avenue is often the only option for Black community members and other people of color, indigenous communities that have been victimized by, racist policies and practices that frankly predate this particular crisis, go back several hundreds of years, frankly. And every time throughout United States history, small communities of color have banded together and found a way through business to meet their needs, overcome the disparities or discrimination barriers that they face looking for traditional employment or being hired or being limited to very, very low wage jobs. Small business has been that avenue to be able to, first of all, be an outlet for people's creativity with food or clothing or fashion or whatever the business is, but also to be a backbone for their family and for their neighbors to get their needs met, as well as to make some money that generates the kind of wealth that all communities need. So with that as a backdrop, we need to appreciate first and foremost that our current system is, people sometimes say it's broken. I don't think it's broken. I actually think it's rigged not to operate very effectively for people of color, particularly Black people. And so what we need to do is repair that damage. We need to create different approach and paradigm. And incentives is one way, particularly at the local and regional level, that can happen. Governments can design incentives to open up the ability to be in business and to be successful in business to those groups that have been historically excluded. And just to give you a quick example, building on what Michaela is talking about, just in the food system. So we see now, particularly with COVID, the loss of a tremendous component of the food business industry, and that's everything from grocery stores to restaurants to catering. And yet, food, particularly in Los Angeles County, is a major driver of the economy. 1 in 7 people in this county of Los Angeles work in a food business, and those businesses are rarely owned by people of color and Black people. So government, for example, can create incentives to encourage residents of low-income communities, communities of color, to open these businesses, or if they have them, to expand. It can do that by waiving fees or costs for permits. It can do that by helping provide low-interest loans or forgivable loans to do all kinds of structural upgrades that might be necessary, refrigeration and some things like that for a food business, for
Sure.
example, and just a host of other incentives that can lower the cost or provide financial assistance to either open a business or expand it. And there are technical assistance kinds of things, training, business planning that can also be offered. And then the last biggie for me, at least, is incentives to help business operators own their lots and land, so that they not are just providing a business, but are becoming property owners in their communities, which creates a level of stability that can sustain that business operator, and again, their families, their employees. Last point: small business is really the backbone of the U.S. economy, and it's way past time that businesses of color, African American, Black businesses, are able to be participants in that economic boom, that economic asset.
That's great, Mary. So, I mean, you started out with it's a critical part of the economy, that is maybe one of the key places that you've got to be able to participate, the Black community, because there may be other parts of the economy that folks are not able to participate in quite as easily, readily, because of other things that we didn't talk about even here, but discrimination and employment and opportunity. And so, it's really critical that they're able to participate well in entrepreneurship. And then you laid out for us sort of exactly what that looks like, and how the public sector can also be involved in incentivizing with fees and other resources and, loans, which we're going to talk with Robert about right now, in order to sustain those institutions and organizations. So thanks for that. So Robert, let's talk about the work of the Black Cooperative Investment Fund. I mean, the name is pretty exciting all unto itself. You work with microloans and provide capital, especially to what I understand, Black businesses who are not able to receive support from traditional lenders. So how does this impact, this access to capital impact individuals and businesses right now, especially during this economic crisis? And what's the work of the Black Cooperative Investment Fund right now to supply resources to Black-owned businesses?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question, Tanua. I mean, we're really it's a heightened level of consciousness. Obviously, we get asked oftentimes a similar question. But for us, when I say us, I'm speaking about the board of directors and the community of BCIF donors and other thought partners. What we've seen during this crisis, it really just magnifies what we've known all along in terms of the racial wealth gap, barriers to access to capital, and just the economic disparities we experience here in Southern California and across the country. So we're just we're raising our game as best we can on the board. We're talking about several strategies we can execute moving forward. I will say that BCIF has gotten on the radar of funders that I think who normally may not have been paying attention to what BCIF is all about. At BCIF's core, it's really a social change organization that believes fiscal imperatives move the needle of change more so than ethical or moral imperatives. And that's not to say there's no place for efforts that just try to implore people to do the right thing because we believe it's the right thing. But the challenge with that is doing the so-called right thing is so subjective oftentimes. And our history in this country tells us that. But one thing that is pretty much indisputable in a capitalistic society is that when you impact the bottom line, you can get things done. And so in terms of how BCIF, what we're seeing and how BCIF's, the access to capital affects our community differently than what we've seen pre-crisis and where we are now, magnifies the need. It gives our community the encouragement that there's a lifeline for them out there when there are so many barriers to pursuing capital from mainstream or traditional investors. I mean, uh, when BCIF was launched, we saw that there were investors that proclaimed to provide capital to under-resourced communities. And even when we looked at the data there, we were coming out disproportionately on the short end of the stick. So BCIF, its whole reason for existing is just magnified at this point. So we're needed more than ever. BCIF represents a community of folks who are culturally, politically, emotionally, socially invested in the well-being of the Black community. What we call for people to do is to match that level of investment with your financial investment, and understand that if when there are gaps in funding, when there's gaps in access to capital, we have to be the ones to step up. We have the discretionary income to do so. As Michaela said, cooperative economic models are not new. BCIF is not a novel concept. It's one that's just underutilized. And we want to build momentum with what BCIF is doing and implore other people to step up and for self. That's really what we're about. So hopefully I could go on forever. I know you'll stop me. At the end of the day, in terms of how it impacts community differently, it's just magnifying the need for what we need to do.
Well, Robert, I was so excited. I recall when you were starting the fund, like as someone who works in the community development finance space, I knew and understood the need for additional capital sources, specifically for Black-owned entities. You know, unfortunately, almost 96% of the Black-owned businesses have one or no employees.
Right.
So these are really, really small entities that are capital constrained and don't have that additional resource, right? Historically haven't had a public sector or traditional private sector sources. So starting a BCIF is super important. And it's great to hear that some people are discovering you right now under the COVID-19 conditions. But I also think they're discovering you because we also have a new racial awakening in our country, and people are recognizing that the statistics that I just described are not because people don't want to own businesses, don't want to grow. It's just as Mary Lee kind of pointed out, the system is rigged in such a way that it's really difficult for a whole host of reasons for those businesses to be able to access that capital.
Exactly.
And I love this concept of really lifting up, where are we fiscally putting our time and energy and resources, as opposed to stopping at the moral and ethical changes that need to happen. We know those need to go hand in hand, but once you've gotten there, the hope is that you then move to a meaningful, tangible way of investing in these communities. And it's so great that BCIF has been able to help do that.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that I want to just move our conversation to now is talking about kind of where we are. You all are sort of on the front lines of thinking about leading movements and capital and models of economic opportunity, specifically for the Black community and really for all diverse businesses. But Michaela, right now, how have you and the local co-owners of the Sola Food Co-op addressed the impacts of the economic downturn? What's been the impact for the company and for your customers right now?
Well, I have to remind folks that Sola Food Co-op is a startup cooperative, so we are not at store opening yet. We can't wait to secure a site with the capital that we'll need in order to do that, and actually get to store opening and really fill the gap that is needed when we talk about food access in South LA. But some of the things that we have been able to do as a cooperative together is really take a breath, right? And take a beat back and really decide okay, what is our path forward? I think in many ways, we are very fortunate that we aren't a store that newly opened or only had 1 year under its belt in terms of opening, because I think the current pandemic would have turned our model upside down, right? And so we were actually in this space where we're able to live through this, right? And then make changes according to the business model that will be reflective of this moment, right? Because I think the unforeseen costs that so many larger supermarkets and grocery stores have had to undertake as a result of COVID-19 have been vast and and a lot of money, that maybe we would have been in that position. I would also say that, one of the key cooperative principles, and cooperatives are founded on 7 principles, is this idea of democratic member control. So really attending our open board meetings that we have for our member owners so that they can voice like what is our path forward? What are the messages we need to craft so that people understand, like, now more than ever, South LA needs a food cooperative. We have seen for decades, grocery stores, larger, well-known supermarkets close in our community. And it really begs to question, where are people going to get their food? How are people feeding their families? Are they traveling outside of our community where we're losing the opportunity to invest in our own community and keep circulating those dollars in our South LA communities? And so I think we lean in, I think, to the moment. And I really appreciate the opportunity that we also recognize the need to take a breath. And so actually coming up this in a couple of weeks, on October 3rd, we'll have our annual meeting. This is another opportunity for economic participation, like member owner economic participation. It's another cooperative principle rather, that we operate under. And so it's really an opportunity for our member owners to be kind of briefed on everything we've done within the year, but also have their input heard. How are we getting to store opening? How do we chart this path together? So not just one single person, but us collectively and collaboratively.
I'm so glad that I wanted to make the connection with the lack of fresh food, the lack of food options in terms of how families are able to procure the necessary sort of everyday things that people take for granted who are in other neighborhoods, like not having the grocery stores there. And so that is, one issue that you're addressing with this model. The other piece is that, well, if we don't have it, then let's bring it. And maybe there isn't one person in the community who can open a full-on grocery store, but there are several people who together with their collective buying power are able to bring this kind of critical resource to everybody in the community. And given that we're in a COVID pandemic, I mean, you've got to stay safer at home. You've got to be able to get to food sources that are within a pretty short distance, given, where the state of the world is. So having this kind of resource is, almost an imperative from a public health perspective. But then you've been able to couple that with how do we also economically undergird the communities as well at the same time. So I was like, I'm hoping that we get to this idea that food and economic opportunity can go hand in hand with
That's
this
right.
model. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So, Robert, we've got, part of what we were seeing, I'm sure, you were hearing from some of your borrowers who had probably attempted to try and get support from the federal government at some point early on, especially when the Paycheck Protection Program was open and some other SBA products. Can you talk a little bit about what you were hearing and what were some of the challenges in terms of folks being able to access this resource that seemingly was available for everybody, but we did PPP loans, so I can give that experience. But I'd love to hear what you were hearing.
Yeah, well, I think we heard a lot. One of the main things we were hearing is that if you didn't have an established relationship with a bank, then your chances of getting a loan were slim to none, essentially. And since so many of our Black-owned businesses, I think you mentioned to Noah earlier during our discussion that about 95% of Black-owned businesses have basically just one employee or sole proprietorships. And so when you're talking about businesses that have gross revenues that are oftentimes pretty small, and they are running on kind of with a mom and pop kind of mo for various reasons. They don't have those relationships with the mainstream financial institutions. So that is and was certainly a barrier. I'd say many people not knowing exactly kind of where to turn, even though we were all bombarded with the opportunities for PPP loans and what that looks like. Some feeling like they weren't ready in terms of their basic financials. That just being able to present basic P&L or balance sheet, things like that, have served as barriers all along, and those are just amplified during these times. Historically, Black-owned businesses, we rely on cash to fund our businesses, about 40 to 45%. The data shows about another 15% rely on funding from friends and family. And so when you look at that, 55%, give or take, aren't even looking at mainstream institutions and haven't even heard of CDFI. So many. We talk to Black business owners that don't really know what a CDFI means, and that's a viable resource. So I think really just not having knowledge of the landscape, not having relationships with mainstream lenders, we see all of that plus some. So all of that is just being exacerbated by the time that we're in now. Again, I mentioned earlier, BCIF is perceived as a lifeline for many. The loans are 5 to 20,000, which for many business owners may not seem like a lot, but if you're talking about 95 or so percent having one employee, then that could be a big deal. It can make or break businesses that are struggling to stay afloat. The data tells us, and I'm sure we're all familiar with this, that about 40% of Black-owned businesses nationwide have gone away. Now, I think the jury's still out on whether any of them will come back after this. We shall see. But I think some of that is due to a lack of access to capital. Some of it is due to lack of having a lifeline. Some of it is due to just kind of throwing in the white towel. Some of it is due to folks just continuing to work their 9 to 5s and giving up their quote unquote side hustles for now. So we're seeing a whole gamut of issues at this point. But I would like to think that BCIF fills the funding gap by being a lifeline and not having the same restrictive requirements that so many other mainstream and even alternative lenders have. For example, there's no credit check with BCIF. There is some baseline criteria in terms of if you're a startup, what your prospectus looks like, if you've been around for a bit, how have you performed historically, if you have the ability on some level to repay, because that is important. We pay it forward, so it's important that borrowers can pay back into the fund so that we can support more and more businesses. And we're very clear about that. BCIF really merges the best of cooperative economics, self-help models, philanthropic models, crowdfunding, all of that rolled into one. And so we make it very clear, look, okay, the parameters are not what you'd find at some of your other typical lenders, but it's really important that everyone has a stake in this, and that it's not that you're African American, you put your name on the application, that's that. It's really important that we support one another. We pay back into it so that everyone can have a lifeline. So I think ultimately that's it. It's a lifeline that is specifically for us by us, and that has been encouraging for some. But I think as we move forward through this discussion, I'll share with you some of the other takeaways we've seen in terms of even with that lifeline being available, it still hasn't been enough for some of us. And so I'll defer on that until later.
So
I'm not
yeah,
monopolizing the conversation.
We're gonna have another conversation with you and just walk through what's happening and kind of what what you see as the need and you know, where you'd like to see the market go. But since you do have the mic, and I'm going to get ready to close out here, just a couple of thoughts that, you know, to kind of leave us with as far as today. What do you think is the outlook for BCIF, and what are you seeing in terms of the future for Black business?
Well, I'm certainly hopeful. Otherwise, and we're hopeful. The board and the whole network of what we call the family, the BCIF family. We're hopeful. Otherwise, we wouldn't continue to to move forward. I think it's going to be critical that this is a sustained movement, not just a snapshot in time. That's probably my biggest concern. Is not only from you know our allies slash accomplices that they're in it for the moment, that they are in it in this battle with us over an extended period of time, and even those of us within the African American community, that we're not we don't have this elevated level of consciousness just for the moment. In order to address the gaps for Black businesses and really more broadly, the economic well-being of our community, it's going to take a sustained movement. And typically, we tend to function from a reactive standpoint. I think we have to be proactive and be engaged in a sustained way to make sure that our businesses are healthy and intact,
And have what they need.
and have what they need. I mean, it's economic viability of our Black businesses are they're critical to the overall well-being of our community as a whole. I think that's a no-brainer, and so we have to look out for them.
So, Robert, tell people where they can find out more information about BCF. What is the web address?
The website is B as in boy, C as in cat, I as in Ike, F as in Frank, U, N as in Nancy, D as in David, bcifund.org. You can find the organization on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at BCI Fund. And before we wrap up, I really want to emphasize to folks, BCIF started as a pool fund intended to lean on what we call kind of everyday Joe and Susie to put skin in the game. This year, we've seen institutional investors get involved, so some foundation and corporate support.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And this has definitely been a part of that with COVID grant. So BCIF is really appreciative of that. But we're also aware that that kind of funding can be episodic, seasonal, and we know at the end of the day, those who are most impacted by the communities that affect our community need to stay involved, be engaged, have skin in the game. And so we're hoping we continue to increase momentum there. So BCIF will go as far as the community pushes it to go at the end of the day. It'll be as impactful and as successful as the people who are involved with it push it to be.
Well, we appreciate your leadership on that, you and the board. So thanks for sharing that. Now, Michaela, we're about to wrap up, but folks are probably really interested in learning more about the cooperative model. You'll tell us about that, and what's the plans right now? Everybody needs something to eat at this moment, and there are very few places to get it right now. So you all must be pretty popular.
I know. Yes. Currently, we sell organic grains and beans. We've also been able to partner with Community Services Unlimited with their CSA box to provide fresh produce. And we're constantly thinking, as we get to store opening, what are the different vendors that we can bring into the fold so that we start continuing to kind of live this mission. Like, we're going to be a full service grocery store, not a supermarket, but a grocery store. So a smaller, market print of that. But we want people to say, these are the vendors that we're working with. These are the businesses that we value. We want to be able to uplift, startup businesses as well and carry really high quality product and lift up our Black and brown people of color and women-owned businesses, to have that, a good percentage of those products on our shelf. It's a store opening. So we're in an exciting space because we're exploring and we're building partnerships, which is the best place to be.
Where can people find out about getting connected and being part of the cooperative?
Sure. I always say if you live, work, play, and or play in South LA, then you need to join Sola Food Co-op. And you can find us at solafoodcoop.com. That's SOLAFOODCOOP.com. And you can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Sola Food Co-op.
Great. Well, thank you both for being on. And we lost Mary Lee in the middle there. We'll have to have another conversation with her. We know what a wealth of knowledge she is about various economic development policies. We want to thank all of you out there for joining us this week on the Changemakers LA podcast. We appreciate the great sort of insight that we got from our guests today. And thanks for all of you and joining in on this conversation. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love for you to subscribe to the podcast so you're notified of new episodes that you can share with your colleagues as well. If you're a small business in need of grant funding, please don't forget to visit lacovidfund.org, and you can also visit ascendla.org to learn more about how we're growing the next generation of $1 million plus businesses owned by women and people of color. This episode of Changemakers LA was made possible by our partner, JP Morgan Chase. If you'd like to learn more about how we provide capital support for small businesses at LISC LA, please visit us online at www.lisc.org. That's LISC.org/Los Angeles. And follow us on Twitter at LISC_LA. You can find the rest of the series on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Subscribe to hear more conversations about the people and places that shape Los Angeles.